Hi everyone, welcome to the August 11th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragon, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to look back at Travers weekend at Saratoga. Obviously, the main event was won by Tiz the Law, really cementing himself as the favorite heading into the Kentucky Derby in 4 weeks. We also had some stakes action at Ellis Park, Derby prep there. The Ellis Park Derby won by Art Collector. We'll get to that in a little bit, but the main focus this week really is recapping the Saratoga races. They had the Travers undercard with a few noteworthy performances, particularly Gamine in the test and her very fast tying for the stakes record time. We'll talk about all of that in a little bit. We'll also mention some racing from elsewhere in the country, like Del Mar and Monmouth Park later in the show, because there were some impressive performances out there as well. But Craig, Tiz the Law is the main story. You know, a lot of us were waiting for him to sort of come with this breakout performance. He had run pretty well in the Belmont Stakes, hadn't really stepped forward from a speed figure standpoint since early in the year, though. But this effort in the Travers was really something else and sort of on a different plane for him.
Yeah, you put it exactly as I've been saying. He hadn't really had that breakout race, but I think this was it. It was a career best speed figure from us, a 126 on the TimeformUS scale, which is the best we've seen from a 3-year-old, at least a 3-year-old male. I can't remember. I don't think Gamine had topped that yet, but definitely from a 3-year-old male. So just a strong performance, absolutely disposed of Uncle Chuck with just ridiculous ease and was never really threatened at any point in the race. Now, I will say the pace was moderate at best. We do have a couple of the fractions coded in blue, but I don't want to penalize Tiz the Law too much for that because he's the kind of horse who has shown it really doesn't matter. He just is able to adapt to whatever piece is thrown at him in every race but one in his whole career, and he just looks like the ultimate professional to me, and he's going to be very tough in the Kentucky Derby.
I think we always proceed with a little bit of skepticism when you have a horse like Tiz the Law who's winning very easily, not doing so against the best competition. I mean, not to knock the fields that he beat in the Florida Derby and the Belmont Stakes, but I think we all recognize the horses that finish directly behind him are not going to be major players in races like the Derby and the Preakness coming up in a couple months. But you always want to be a little bit skeptical because these horses, they do have to run those fast speed figures to be considered, the real dominant forces that they'll have to be to continue to win races like the Derby and the Preakness. And I've got to say, even after his Belmont Stakes victory, I was somebody who was not quite buying into the idea that this could be a horse that could sweep the Triple Crown necessarily, just because it seems like it's such a hard year to do it. You've got to keep horses at their top form level for about 4 months this year, from early June all the way to early October. But at this point, I mean, it's seeming like he actually might be able to pull it off because this horse is better than I think most of us gave him credit for. The performance in this Travers, I mean, I'd love to get a sectional time for the eighth of a mile that he ran from the quarter pole to the eighth pole in the stretch, that penultimate eighth of a mile, because, I mean, Manny Franco was just sitting on him coming to the quarter pole. As soon as he took the whip out and asked this horse to run, he just rocketed away from his competition. I mean, I don't want to say that a horse could have run a lot faster, because often that's not the case when a jockey gears a horse down at the end of the race, but Manny stood up at the eighth pole, and just let this horse gallop into the wire. This was really something else. And on top of all of that, the fact that he was geared down, he came home his final quarter mile in 24-2. It was just an extremely impressive performance. As you said, the TimeformUS speed figure of 126, the best we've seen so far. He did it the right way. He went wide around both turns, really took it to his main rival, Uncle Chuck, on the far turn, and that horse just wasn't up to the challenge. I'm a huge fan of this horse, and I mean, he proved to me everything that I needed to see. Any outstanding questions I had, I think he answered in this race, and he just heads into the Kentucky Derby as an overwhelming favorite.
Yeah, and I think deservedly so. Now, I mean, there will be people who will say he still didn't beat much. He hasn't really faced any of the so-called top contenders, but sometimes I think you just have to put that aside. This horse is winning so easily. I mean, he's going to be a heavy favorite in the Derby. There are going to be some others that will probably pose a more formidable challenge than what we've seen in the last couple, but just really hard to knock anything this horse has done. I mean, we've been talking about him, seems like forever, since he broke his maiden in a New York bred special weight in a race where he wasn't even favored, and he's just done nearly everything perfectly since.
No, I mean, you want to get excited about horses that can sort of transcend the sport and really get fans excited and become those special thoroughbreds. And, people kind of latch on to horses that they hope can get to that status, and they don't quite get there more often than not. But I mean, Tiz the Law, it seems like he's showing all the tools that it would be required to really accomplish those feats. That I don't want to get ahead of myself and say he's favored to win the Triple Crown, because it's hard to do, and especially this year. But I think Tiz the Law is a horse that we can start to get our hopes up about. Speaking of really special 3-year-olds, we saw one in the race just prior to the Travers, as the Longines Test was won in dazzling fashion by Gamine. Really very similar to her Acorn score, just facing a better rival in Venetian Harbor this time, but she still handled that horse with ease. Say what you will about the early pace of this race and how competitive it was, but Gamine is just so good right now. I mean, we'll see how far she wants to go, and if a race like the Kentucky Oaks can expose any potential stamina limitations, but she's just better than the three-year-old fillies right now.
Yeah, that was some performance. She wound up with a 120 TimeformUS speed figure. It was knocked down from a final time of 127 because of that slow pace that you mentioned. And I don't think there's any doubt it was a slow pace. A horse like her, you just kind of got to leave it to the handicappers to decide if you think she could keep running those 127 type final time figures as the pace quickened up. It's a tough call. It's one of those where watching her, I would sure think that she could. I don't think the way she runs away from horses in the stretch. I do have similar concerns to you going along. Her one close win was over Speech, which she was actually DQ'd from later on. But I don't think the DQ. I don't think the positive she had that day really was something that affected her performance at all. So maybe there's a little concern. That was at 1 1/16. Maybe if she tries the Oaks, 1 1/8 might be testing her limits. But just watching her, I mean, she looks like a superstar and the kind of horse I'm not looking forward to bet against anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, just to put that, the fact that we're penalizing her for setting a slow pace, and as we always do with these sprinters and TimeformUS PPs and with the speed figures, just to kind of put that in context, we talked about it a lot with Volatile when he won the Alfred G. Vanderbilt. He got a minor pace deduction, but he had gotten bigger ones in his prior starts. We talked about it with Mitoli when he was, setting slow paces and coming home very quickly. What would happen when he would encounter a faster pace situation? I mean, the thing with Gamine that's different from those horses is that she's not going to be campaigned as a sprinter in all likelihood, at least in the near future. They're probably going to stretch her out and try some of the bigger prizes going longer. So I'm not sure how much it really matters that she set a slow pace in this race, because it's not like she's going to have to run a whole lot faster than this in the races that they're pointing her to in the immediate future. The big question is, as you said, how far can she go? I don't know how much stock you really are supposed to put in that Oaklawn race. Even though the decision was close, turns out Speech is really good in her own right, and it seems like we didn't just get the best of Gamine that day because she was still sort of in that development phase. She had run much slower in her debut. She took a step forward second time out, took a big step forward from her second start to the Acorn. So given the current version of Gamine, I'd be hard-pressed to see anybody challenging her. We'll see if the 1 1/8 exposes her in the Kentucky Oaks. But at this point, I mean, for a 7 furlong to a mile type of filly, she's right up there with the best that we've seen going back decades.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And to be honest, I think we just saw a really special 3-year-old filly sprinter last year in Kofefi. And she may be as good or even better than her.
Yeah, and I saw some chatter about Venetian Harbor and her connections not being happy with the tactics, not going after Gamine in the early going. Personally, I don't think the result was ever going to be different. And when you're putting on the rider that they put on Venetian Harbor, I mean, I guess you can't really be surprised when you get that kind of ride, because that's what you typically see at Saratoga. I mean, this race fell right in line with everything else we see, from claiming races right up to stakes races. That's just the kind of pace situation that you got to get used to. That's how the riders in New York ride these races.
Yeah, if I was going to get a rider for Venetian Harbor to really try to take it to Gamine, and I'm with you, I don't think it would have made a difference at all, and maybe it would have cost Venetian Harbor second, but Joel Rosario is not the guy I would have picked, as great a rider as he is. I mean, Kendrick Carmouche wasn't in the race. If I wanted somebody to go, that's who I'd put on.
No, Luis Saez is a very aggressive rider. I'm not looking to see if he had a mount in that race,
Yeah, he did. He was on Up in Smoke.
but it's a good transition to the other 7 furlong race on Saturday, the Grade 1 Ballerina, because he was also riding Serengeti Empress, who just took no prisoners on the front end. I mean, she drew the rail, so really Tom Amos and the Connections had no choice but to send her in this race, and send her they did, and she went some pretty fast fractions up front, really as fast as you're going to see in a race at this level. They took it to her on the front end. Latruska tried to go with her and really gave her all the pressure that she possibly could coming around the far turn. And I could even see Ricardo Santana on Latruska kind of looking around coming to the quarter pole, because Serengeti Empress had already come under pressure at about the 5/16 pole, but turning back from those route races, she just kept finding more on the lead, turned back every challenge, and this was as game as a racehorse could possibly be for her to win this race by a length.
Yeah, this was quite a performance from her. She wound up with a 127 TimeformUS speed figure, which matches what she ran in the test last year against Kofefi, and she did it with things just not going her way at all. She didn't break particularly sharply. She rushed up. She faced a lot of pressure early, and she fought it off. And then even in the stretch, it looked like Bellafina, who had sat in behind and just seemed like she was loaded, was going to run by her, and Serengeti Empress just dug deep and found a way to hold on. And I was just super impressed by the race by Serengeti Empress, even figures aside. I mean, it's a huge figure. It's as good as we've seen from sprinters this year of either sex, and just a really big race from her. And I suspect they're going to keep her sprinting now. I hope we don't see any more of those runoff route races from her. And it seemed that Tom Amos was leaning that way on the Fox show. So just a really good sprinter. She probably, as you said earlier, won't have to face a horse like Amin. But if she did, it would be a matchup that I'd be signed up for and ready to see any day of the week.
No, she's kind of a funny horse, because even though she's a Kentucky Oaks winner, in retrospect, she probably is a sprinter who's just so good that she's been able to stretch her speed around the 2 turns, going a mile and a 16th, sometimes a mile and an eighth when the pace situation works out. She's been able to be successful in some of these races because she just has so much quality to her. But her natural speed makes her such an effective sprinter. And if you sort of just crossed out all those route races and really just took into account her acorn, her test, and now this Ballerina, we'd be talking about her like one of the most exciting filly sprinters of the past 10 years or so, given the speed figures that she's run in some of those races. But they've just kind of kept going after those bigger tests in the longer races, as, you know, you can't blame the Connections for doing, because that's where the real accolades are. But she's just so talented and so fast, and I'm glad to see they're going to keep her in sprint races moving forward.
Yeah, the other thing I want to note is I did think Bellafina ran well. I think we can write off that California narrative, even though she didn't win. I know neither of us particularly bought into that anyway, as she had run a couple decent races outside of California. But I thought she ran well. She was just beaten by the better horse. Unfortunately, I think we're seeing Your Horse Come Dancing just isn't the same horse that she was last year, earlier in the year. And I was really surprised she was bet so heavily in here, as I imagine you were as well, but just not a whole lot from her. Strong race, but, you know, Serengeti Empress was clearly best and certainly earned this win.
Yeah, there were a few things about the wagering on Saturday's races that surprised me a little bit, not least of which was Pink Sands getting bet down to 9-2 in this race. If she couldn't be successful with this kind of pace scenario, I don't think she has much of a future in Grade 1 races. Yeah, Come Dancing, just not quite the same horse anymore. But I will say, there was a lot of chatter about these 3 favorites, Serengeti Empress, Bellafina, and Come Dancing coming in, and how untrustworthy all of them seemed to be. And by and large, they pretty much showed up. I mean, Come Dancing's not the same horse that she was in early 2019, but they all put in respectable efforts. And as you said, I wouldn't be too down on Bellafina. She did hang a little bit at the end, but I think that was just Serengeti Empress digging in and beating her.
Yeah, and even I thought Latruska ran well. She actually wound up, because of the pace, with a 118 TimeformUS speed figure, and maybe she's just one that's kind of the opposite of Serengeti Empress. She's better off using her speeds in longer races as she had been doing, and found the cutback just a little too quick, but I didn't think she lost much in defeat here either.
Now, sticking with the sprinters and moving over to turf, the race they ran right after the Ballerina on Saturday at Saratoga was the Grade 3 Troy, going 5.5 furlongs. And this one featured a bit of a, I mean, every disqualification is controversial these days, so it's kind of redundant to call a disqualification controversial. But Imprimis, who crossed the wire first and was much the best, got disqualified and placed third in this race. It was a situation where, if you watch the head-on, he definitely came in on Shecky Shabazz, almost certainly cost that horse second place. There is a real, it's a valid point to say that he also cost Pulsate a position and maybe he should have been placed fifth in this race. I totally see that argument and I kind of agree with it. But based on the decisions that the New York stewards make every single day, this was consistent. And when you're dealing with Category 2 rules, these horses just need to get disqualified, and that's the way it is.
Yeah, I would agree. These are the real tough ones where the horse like Imprimis was never going to lose that race, whether he had fouled Shecky Shabazz and Pulsate or not. He was the best horse, and you just hate to see a horse this DQ'd in that spot. I don't think there's any doubt he was best, and particularly when the horse who was elevated to the win, who's a really cool story in American Sailor, there was no way he deserved to win. He wasn't involved in the foul at all. It was just a circumstantial thing that he got put on top. It's just one of the tough parts of the game. I'm kind of torn on the Category 1 and 2 thing because I see cases that go either way. I see Category 1 calls where it seems like riders just foul to get out when they're stuck in a bad spot, and I don't particularly like that either. So I don't know which way to go. But as you say, it's a consistent call in New York. As soon as I saw the head-on, I assumed it was going to come down, just like we saw the week before, and that's the way they rule in New York. And as bettors, all we can ask for is consistency, and that's what we're getting.
Yeah, it's one of those situations where people, I mean, I don't want to, people criticize the stewards for being inconsistent, and I would argue that everybody else is inconsistent because they want the rules to be interpreted based on the specific situation, and because Imprimis won by 2 1/4 lengths and was so much the best, because that's a pretty wide margin in a turf sprint, people were arguing that he shouldn't have come down when, based on the way the rules are applied, that doesn't really matter. What matters is that Shecky Shabazz was cost a position. In Category 1, that would matter. And just to kind of explain the difference to people who aren't familiar with these terms, Category 1 rules, which are used mostly overseas, a lot in Europe, it would be the stewards would have to ask the question, would Shecky Shabazz have finished ahead of Imprimis if he hadn't been fouled? And clearly the answer in this situation is no. So in Category 1, there would not have been a disqualification. In Category 2 rules, the question the stewards are tasked with answering is, would Shecky Shabazz have finished ahead of American Sailor? Would he have been cost any position? And obviously the answer there is yes, because Shecky Shabazz lost by a head bob for second. So I think that Category 2 rules are just a little bit unfair to horses that cause incidents that are not right before the wire, because horses can win by a wide margin and get disqualified, and I don't think that's really serving any kind of justice. I think just working from a Category 1 baseline, if you implement those rules, you can put things on top of that, like stricter suspensions, more exorbitant fines that might be able to correct some of the stuff that I know you'd be worried about, Craig, riders abusing the rules. But it's a tricky situation because there's no clear-cut answer, and there's no set of rules that's going to satisfy everybody in every single situation.
Yeah, and the only other thing I want to add is if listeners get a chance out there, if you use TimeformUS PPs, you have lifetime past performances, just take a look through the winter American Sailor's past performances and see where he was and the list of just how many tracks where he's run and where he's won at. It's quite extensive. It's not something you're going to see very often in today's racing game, and it's just a fun thing to see. It's a shame his win's a little bit tainted, but it's a really cool horse.
I'm actually glad you said that, because the one horse that we kind of lost completely in this conversation was the winner, American Sailor, who, as you said, he's a cool horse. He's got a ton of speed. He's been in top form forever. He's won, I think, now 15 races in his life out of 45 starts. Just an awesome 8-year-old, and we kind of just glossed over him in this discussion of the controversy around the DQ, so I'm glad you brought that up. And wrapping up the stakes action on Saturday at Saratoga was the Grade 3 weigh for the older fillies and mares going 1.5 miles. Not as much drama here, though. Jose Ortiz did sort of get a little bit of consolation prize after getting disqualified in the Troy, as he guided the winner, My Sister Nat, to victory in this weigh. And Jose Ortiz, I think, deserves all the credit for this victory because he worked out a perfect trip for this mare, saved ground around both turns, was able to get the jump on Mississippi at the top of the stretch and really built up the momentum, whereas Mississippi kind of had to come and get her, despite the fact that she had better position early in the race. Good battle to the wire, but My Sister Nat just seems like she's really turned a corner for Chad Brown.
Yeah, she got a 120 Timeform US for the win. I should mention before we go too far, I think I forgot to mention the figures for the last race. Primus got a 121, American Sailor a 119. My Sister Nat got a 120, which is right about what she ran last time with when she was the runner-up. This looked like a two-horse race on paper. I know on the forecast we both like My Sister Nat a lot, mostly because of the fact Mississippi was coming off a layoff, and I think that's exactly how it played out. If these two were to face each other next time, given the rides that we saw, I would probably reverse my top selections, but I thought the top two ran very well. They were clear standouts to me, and nothing overly surprising for me here.
No, I agree with that. My Sister Nat obviously is the younger half-sister to Sister Charlie. Been a disappointment for much of her career, but it seems like she's finally hitting her stride now. And you gotta say, this victory for her really flatters Mean Mary, who just totally trounced her in the New York last time. Obviously, My Sister Nat was a bit against the pace that day, but I don't think that these fillies we saw in the weigh are nearly on par with that horse, Mean Mary, and I'll be interested to see where she runs next. One more race to mention from Saturday's card early in the day was a maiden race for the 2-year-olds, won by Todd Pletcher's highly touted Mutasabek, going the 5.5 furlongs. This is a horse who the word was out on him long before his debut. I watch a bunch of those workouts on XBTV to kind of help me make the morning lines in these races, and I saw some other Todd Pletcher 2-year-olds debut early in the meet, and he was working in company with some of them and just outworking all of those horses, coming in with some of the fastest breezes we've seen from any Todd Pletcher horse debuting in recent years, as far back as I can remember. This horse delivered. Not the fastest speed figure we're going to see in one of these races, but he looked pretty good.
Yeah, he did. This is one, he got a 98 speed figure. Final time was 100. We have it coded in blue early. It was kind of slow for a 5.5 furlong race, but keep in mind, they don't run a lot of these on dirt, so I'm kind of using a shaky baseline to be fair. Normally when these are run, they're off the turf races. So I'm not going to put a lot of stock in that. And I just really liked how he did it. He was able to raid off horses. I know I've talked about this before with 2-year-olds. I like seeing that much more than the flashy wire-to-wire scores that we see sometimes with big figures. He was wide on the turns and just won as easy as could be. So for a 2-year-old, when he runs back, probably in a stake next time out, I would think. I'm not going to bet him like he's a 98 type horse. He's probably more like a 108 horse at this point, based on my visuals here.
Yeah, and I should also note, he wasn't the quickest out of the gate either, which is something we've kind of grown accustomed to seeing with Todd Pletcher's 2-year-olds for whatever reason. But a little sluggish at the start, but he quickly got into position. And like you said, I just thought he really finished off the race with good power, and he's one to look forward to in the future. As is another 2-year-old that we saw on Friday, this time in a stakes race, the Grade 2 Saratoga Special. Feels like this was one of the strongest 2-year-old races that we've seen so far this year, as Jackie's Warrior once again got the best of the ride of a lifetime. These two had faced off in a maiden race at Churchill Downs earlier this year that came up pretty fast, and they carried that forward into this race as they just dominated the rest of the horses in this field. Jackie's Warrior has a ton of speed. He broke on top, and you could tell going down the backstretch, this horse just was like a keg of dynamite underneath Joel Rosario, and when he asked him at the top of the stretch, these two just rocketed away from the rest of the field.
Yeah, he got a 109 Timeform US for the win, which is really nice for a 2-year-old this early in the season. And as you said, at least as of Friday, it was the best 2-year-old figure. I don't think anybody topped it over the weekend off the top of my head, but just a really strong performance. He looks like a total sprinter to me. I'm curious on your take for that, but there's nothing wrong with having a really good sprinter in the barn, and he's going to be tough to beat anytime soon at these shorter distances.
Yeah, he seems a lot like his sire, McLean's Music, who was just this big, good-looking, burly kind of horse. And obviously, Jackie's Warrior is that same kind of horse. He seems like he has a lot of size to him. Seems very developed for August of his 2-year-old season. So we'll see how he progresses and how some other horses might catch up to him in time, because it was kind of a weird juxtaposition to see the ride of a lifetime chasing him down the stretch, because he seems just like in physical stature to be a much smaller horse than Jackie's Warrior, but definitely one that's really developed ahead of his competition. So we'll see how these two continue as the distances get longer. But Steve Asmussen said he's going to point this horse to the hopeful, and he's definitely one to be excited about for later in the summer. Wrapping up the Saratoga Stakes action from earlier this week, we'll actually discuss two more races, one from, I think, Thursday, another from Sunday. Both of them won by Todd Pletcher going the same distance. First, with the fillies and mares, Nona Madeline took the Summer Colony. Last year, the Summer Colony actually became pretty important in this division, as Blue Prize, the 2019 winner, went on to win the Breeders' Cup Distaff. I don't know if that same fate will await Nona Madeline, but she was pretty impressive in this race because she engaged a good horse in Golden Award in a race-long duel and was able to get away from her late, and I thought both of these horses ran very well.
Yeah, this was, as you kind of allude to, pretty much a match race from the start, and Nona Madeline just got the better of her. She got ran a 1:16 TimeformUS speed figure. She's a horse who had won her debut as a 2-year-old and kind of flattened out, had just a win in an allowance race since at Gulfstream over the winter, and hadn't been able to put much together. But the fans weren't surprised here, the better. She went off at even money and backed up that 1:16 she ran last time, and solid enough effort. I don't think we saw any Blue Prize type performance in here. I don't see this kind reaching those kind of heights, but she could move into grade 3, maybe even grade 2 if she catches the right fields.
Yeah, I agree with that. She's a horse that has really stepped forward this year for Todd Pletcher, because I remember her as a 2-year-old. She was fast, didn't have a lot of stamina, looked kind of like one of those horses that was destined to be a disappointment. And, Todd Pletcher doesn't always get the credit for rehabilitating horses like this and getting them to go longer distances than it seems like they should be able to go, because she is bred to be more of a sprinter. But she's just gotten better with every start this year, was beaten by Latruska a couple times in some very fast races. Now she's really blossoming, going 2 turns. Just a cool horse who seems like she's hitting her stride now as a 4-year-old. You could say many of the same things about Todd Pletcher's winner on Sunday of the Alydar spinoff, who, again, was a horse that had shown promise early on, was on the Derby trail, ran okay, I think, at the Belmont Stakes, was beaten a long way in the Kentucky Derby, had to be put away for a long time last year after winning an allowance at Saratoga. Didn't come back in top form early this year, but there were some signs that maybe Todd Pletcher was getting him going back in the right direction prior to this race, and he showed up with a career best speed figure, beat a good horse and endorsed. I think the pace maybe had something to do with that, because there were some questionable tactics on one of his main rivals, Bodie Express, but Spinoff definitely showed up to win this race.
Yeah, that was pretty baffling, and I have to credit you. I actually cashed a bet on this horse, because I remember when I picked Spinoff when he came back at 7 furlongs against Global Campaign, and you kind of alluded to the fact that he's a horse who definitely wanted more distance. You even, I think, specifically mentioned the 1 1/8. So I kind of put a line through his last race and just bet him based off of that. So props to you for that one. Yeah, it was a strong effort. He got a 1:20 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. As you said, the early fractions are coded in blue. I have no idea what was going on with Javier Castellano on Bodie Express. Not sure why rating him was the plan. I didn't particularly like him in this spot anyway, but some of these jockey decisions are pretty baffling, I have to say, when it comes to pace at Naira. But if you're playing Saratoga every day, not to be surprised by this anymore, especially on turf, but it happens on dirt as well.
Yeah, Spinoff is one of these horses, and it was one of my few good opinions on Sunday, so I don't want to, he was only 3-1 in this race, but he's a horse that I think for whatever reason they got a little bit fooled off that 7 furlong race in running him shorter distances one too many times. I think the mile last time was just a bit too sharp for him, and stretching back out to the 1 1/8 with a more gradual pace situation, it allowed him to not be outrun in the early going and be right on top of the pace. And I think that's the way this horse really wants to run, and he was just able to grind it out over Endorsed, who might just want to go slightly shorter than this. Endorsed is obviously in good form now and has taken a step forward from 3 to 4, but it seemed like he really blossomed going the shorter distances. The one turn mile and 16th against Code of Honor just seems like maybe a mile and an eighth is pushing him a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Is the speed figures tell the same story? He's probably getting at the end of his rope at that distance, and because he definitely looked like he flattened out a little bit in here. His spinoff was running away from him late.
All right, let's get back to the Derby Trail horses and go to Ellis Park, where on Sunday they ran what I believe is a new race, the Ellis Park Derby. And Art Collector, who is coming into the Kentucky Derby now as one of the main rivals to Tiz the Law, really, I think, cemented himself as the likely second choice in that race with this pretty easy victory over attachment rate. I mean, if we're going to criticize some of the fields that Tiz the Law has beaten, I think we have to be realistic here and say that Art Collector was not beating the cream of the crop in either this race or the Bluegrass two-back, but Art Collector is nevertheless running some pretty respectable speed figures, and he should give a good account of himself in the Derby. He's a real rival for Tiz the Law.
He is. He got a 124, so for the win, just 2 points below what Tiz the Law earned in the Travers. And, I have to admit, when I watched this race at first, I wasn't all that impressed. I put that on Twitter and, of course, got beat up by the Twitter police for the most part. Some people agreed with me. But when I did the figures, he ran a career best, a point higher than he did last time in the Bluegrass. And watching the race again, I mean, he did face some pressure. He was on the lead on the rail, but he was pressured throughout. The fractions were okay. The pace figures are slightly higher than the final time figure, but when he was asked, he just pulled away. Personally, I would have liked to seen him rate a little bit and maybe pass some horses in the stretch, because I don't think there's any shot he's going to lead in a race like the Derby, but I guess we got to wait and see how the field shapes up before making those kind of decisions. So no real knocks on him at all. He's running fast, and he's certainly one of the main contenders that could upset Tiz the Law.
Yeah, I kind of know what you're getting at with your initial reaction to this race, because on paper it seemed like there were a few horses that could have shown a bit more speed or perhaps gotten in front of him in the early going and they weren't ridden that aggressively. But nevertheless, Art Collector set an honest pace in this race and just kept going. We had been concerned early on in the year about him stretching out around 2 turns, but it seems like he's really best going as far as a mile and an eighth, and we'll see about the mile and a quarter for him. Obviously, Tiz the Law has already answered that question, as he did on Saturday in the Travers, but Art Collector certainly doesn't show any signs of stopping at the ends of these races. He's going to have to beat better horses than attachment rate, obviously. But these 3-year-olds, really across the board, are taking the kind of steps forward that you'd expect to see in July and August of the summers of their 3-year-old seasons. It's kind of a weird year because typically, we'd be so impressed by numbers like this if they were being earned back in March and April. Now we're all the way in the middle of summer and they're earning these kinds of speed figures. And it's what you'd expect to see with natural development later in the year. And I will just add, some of the older horses in races like the Whitney and others that have taken place around the country, they're not running speed figures that are a whole lot faster than this crop of 3-year-olds, so they're probably not going to match up against each other until the Breeders' Cup Classic, but seems like this is a strong crop relative to the older horses.
It does, and that's even more impressive when you consider all the ones who have fallen by the wayside. Nadal, who very well could have been leading the crop, Charlatan. We've seen some very fast horses that aren't running right now, and I think Nadal's actually been retired. You have to excuse my dog Mason there. He always likes to contribute. Big Nadal fan. But no, like you said, even a horse like Attachment Rate, who I'd say is kind of a second-tier 3-year-old, ran a 120 in here. I imagine we'll see him in the Kentucky Derby being trained by Dale Romans. And I'd just say it wasn't the strongest field, but we did have the winners of the Indiana Derby, of the Ohio Derby, and they weren't even factors. So Art Collector's clearly up there in the top tier.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. He's definitely taken a step forward, and it's going to be a really fun Kentucky Derby this year because it's not like, we were praising Tiz the Law early in this show, but it's not like it's going to be some foregone conclusion that he wins that race. It's going to be a competitive affair. He's a deserving favorite, but he's going to have to show up on the day to beat horses like Art Collector and those California Invaders, Honor AP, Authentic. It's going to be a fun race. One more race to discuss from Ellis Park on Sunday was the Audubon Oaks, going 7 furlongs. This one won by Monday Call. another daughter of Into Mischief like Gamine, and she looked a lot like Gamine winning this race so easily by over 7 lengths, not running quite as fast as that horse and not against a Grade 1 quality field, but she's really blossomed for Brad Cox this year. I know this was a horse that had been highly touted at Saratoga last summer when she was in the barn of Don Chatlos, but she's taken a step forward as a 3-year-old, and it's going to be tough going to face some of the 3-year-old fillies out there if she does step up into graded stakes races soon, but she definitely has talent.
Yeah, no doubt. I'll be honest. I had to, when I saw the name and saw the flashy figure I was given, I had to look her up because I didn't watch this race live or handicap it, and the name just didn't ring a bell. But I saw she had come back with a really strong allowance win at Keeneland, and then I did remember her from last year at Saratoga, even though she didn't run very well. And, she ran a 115 in that comeback win. She ran a 117 here, so while it's not up there with Gamine or some of the top 3-year-old fillies, I don't know what her goals are. She's only sprinted so far, so I doubt she's an Oaks filly, even though this was an Oaks points race. But she certainly looks like a really strong sprinter, and if you assume Gamine's going to run longer races, she may be one of the better 3-year-old filly sprinters out there.
No, I've got no problem with that. The one caveat I'll add to that race is that she did have a main rival, at least on the tote board, in Hello Beautiful, who had posted some gigantic speed figures at Laurel coming into this race, and her race was just over at the start when she got steadied back, and Julien Leperoux had to basically stand up in the irons and wrangle her back to last. So her main rival in this race just basically wasn't in there. She didn't show up with anything close to a competitive effort. So we'll see if Monday Call can do it against better competition next time, but this was definitely an impressive speed figure. Let's move out to California to talk about a couple of stakes races from Del Mar. On Saturday, they ran the Grade 2 Yellow Ribbon, which was a pretty big trifecta, all told, because Beau Recall was the big favorite in this race. She couldn't get in there, and Bodhicitta, coming off a long shot second in the Gamely last time. She improved here to win by a nose over long shot Tona Hutu with 30-1 Harmless in third, kind of an improbable trifecta here. But I think the trips and pace had a lot to do with it, as the horses that were 1-2-3 early finished 3-2-1 at the end of the race, and the closers just could never get involved.
Yeah, it was one of those races on paper that it did look like Beau Recall was a deserving favorite. She had run well in the Just the Game, but if you thought maybe she wasn't going to show up with her A race, the rest of the field just looked wide open, and that's pretty much how it played out. It was nothing flashy from a speed figure standpoint. 117 for Bodhicitta, so just your typical California turf race, I would say. Not really a Grade 2 in stature, but that's what they call them out there, so I guess that's what we got to go with.
Yeah, I mean, I know we don't have any pace figures in this race. I assume there was a timing issue. But, I mean, just looking at it from a visual standpoint, they came home in this race about as fast as you can come home. And from the position that Beau Recall was in, not only at the back of the pack, but trying to make a wide run off the far turn, I mean, she was just never going to be successful in that situation. So I don't want to hold this against her too much. And Bodhicitta just got a perfect ride from Flavien Prat, sitting in behind the speeds, on the rail, saving ground around both turns, peeled out when they got into the stretch and was able to run them down because she's just a slightly better horse than the second and third place finishers. I don't know how much stock I want to put in the results of this race given that pace situation, but the winners definitely improved.
Yeah, you make a good point about the pace. This is a race being a Grade 2. I'm going to go back and try to add pace figures timing from video. It's really tough when the rail's out, as I think it was this day. And to be honest, they're struggling with timing at Del Mar currently, especially on the turf. So it's one where I'm video timing the races, but fractions just can be really tough. I am going to try to do it, and we'll see how it turns out. But when you don't have them, looking at the race as you did, where the top 3 early finished in the top 3 spots, that's a pretty good indicator there wasn't a whole lot of pace in here.
Another turf race from Del Mar Dimension took place on Sunday, the La Jolla Handicap for the 3-year-olds, and Smooth Like Straight, who was only seen a few times this year, I think last at Churchill Downs when he won the War Chant over a pretty deep field, came back here over about a 2.5-month layoff, and got the job done once again. He was the big favorite, deservedly so, off that big speed figure he earned last time, and just seems like he's really blossomed going the 2 turns this year. After looking a bit like a sprinter last year, Mike McCarthy really has him in good form right now.
Yeah, his last two have been really good. I don't have the official speed figure yet. My assistant does, Del Mar, but my guess is it's going to be around a 115, which is really good. That compares pretty well to even the horses we've seen on the East Coast. He has that speed to be a weapon, and he looks like a serious 3-year-old, even being it's California, which, as you know, I don't usually consider quite as high as the East Coast racing on the turf, but he could be the exception.
Yeah, and it's funny, we had some horses that were on the Derby Trail earlier in the year trying the turf here for the first time, Azul Coast, as well as Storm the Court, last year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile winner. He finished second to Smooth Like Straight, so maybe these horses are finding some easier spots on a different surface because the 3-year-old dirt races just look so tough right now. But Smooth Like Straight was just better than these horses, and we'll see if he can do it against tougher company in the future. One more race from Del Mar to touch upon was a 2-year-old race from Saturday's card, actually run right after the yellow ribbon. Dr. Shivel beat a highly touted Bob Baffert horse named Spielberg. That one was a first-time starter. Dr. Shivel was making his third career start, and not quite as fast as the number we saw from Jackie's Warrior in the Saratoga Special, but close to it. This was, I think, the fastest race we've seen for the 2-year-olds in California this year.
Yeah, he got a 105 for the win. Not sure where that race came from based on his last couple. He had lost at Los Al, but as I've mentioned many times on here, sometimes those Los Al races, not that the figures are wrong because they usually line up just fine, but horses just don't seem to run the same when they go elsewhere. But whatever the reason, this was a really strong effort from Dr. Shivel, obviously. I'm not really familiar with the connections, the trainer. Luis Mendez, don't know a whole lot about him, but it sure seems like he has a really good 2-year-old in here. What's interesting to note is the best pal was earlier on the card, and this was just a much, much faster race as a maiden special weight race at the same distance.
No, I mean, this horse really showed up, and if he wasn't in the race, we'd probably be talking about Spielberg, because it's not like he ran that badly to be second here, and what would be considered a respectable speed figure, just in the context of a lot of the other 2-year-old racing we've seen in California so far this year. But Dr. Shivel ran a graded stakes quality speed figure to win his maiden, so like you, I don't know where it came from. I'm not familiar with the connections, but if he continues to be this good, we're going to hear from him in some stakes races moving forward.
Yeah, and this was one where I actually did go, and I'm timing most of the races from Del Mar, and it was one where it fit pretty well with the maiden race. I mean with the Crosby, or not the Crosby, the Best Pal earlier on the card. It was one the difference was so stark I had to check it out, but I don't think there's any doubt had this horse been entered in the stakes race, he would have won. That's how big the disparity is.
Let's wrap up the show this week with one more venue, going to New Jersey to Monmouth Park for their stakes race on Sunday. That was the Oceanport, going a mile on the 16th. Pretty good field assembled for a listed stakes race. You had Synchrony as the slight favorite. He's, I think, 8 years old now. He's just always a presence in these races in the Mid-Atlantic region. But it was the returning Sacred Life for Chad Brown, who just destroyed this field. I mean, Paco Lopez gave him a good trip, but once he got into the clear at the top of the stretch, he just rocketed away from everybody and ran the kind of race that might lead you to believe he would kind of ascend the ranks of the Chad Brown barn and maybe try some tougher graded stakes races very soon.
Yeah, and I'm going to guess this is another one my assistant's handling this figure from Sunday, but just looking at my worksheet, it wouldn't surprise me if it comes back 125, 126 range easily. So definitely a horse who could jump back up in the graded stakes. I mean, this was a good effort. I think we have the paces being on the slow side, and he was able to overcome that from the back. So some of that figure is our boost from the pace, but that definitely is something that works out well on turf, and I think it was a legit big effort from him.
Yeah, I had kind of forgotten about this horse. I mean, he had a little bit of second-itis last year, not quite able to get it done in some stakes for Chad Brown. I didn't remember that he had run so well in the Pegasus World Cup turf. He was fourth that day behind Zulu Alpha at Instilled Regard. This was his first start since then, and it seems like he's just a different horse right now. He's really running well based on this effort, so I'd imagine we'll see him in some Grade 1 races pretty soon, perhaps one like the Shadwell Turf Mile in the fall at Keeneland. We'll see, but based on this effort, he's really firing on all cylinders. That's all the racing to recap for this week. Obviously, Craig and I will continue doing these podcasts, and we'll be back on Friday with a TimeformUS forecast to discuss, I believe, the Saratoga racing this weekend. And the big race is the Alabama on Saturday. I think there are some other stakes races also taking place, so we'll take a look at that card, come up with something to handicap for Friday. But remember, you can always listen to us in these DRF podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back with the TimeformUS forecast on Friday.